Hey everyone, Connor Wander here, back with the Straight from a Scientist podcast. We have a great episode for you today. It's essentially an Alzheimer's disease frequently asked questions episode. So, my field of research is Alzheimer's disease, which is a major neurodegenerative disorder. It's a class of dementia where neurons are dying and are less functional, the brain atrophies, and people have trouble with basic everyday functions, and eventually their functions degrade to the point where they can really no longer carry out their everyday lives or even remember their loved ones. So it's a terrifying disease, but we really, as a society, don't understand it enough. So I brought on Maya Gostyla, who's been on the show before. She runs the All Science blog, which I will absolutely link in the show notes. And we talked basically just about the basics of Alzheimer's disease. So if you had any questions that you were maybe afraid to ask or didn't think to ask about the disease that would help your fundamental understanding of it, we probably answer them in this episode. It's a great baseline for the disease, and we've had a ton of episodes on a little more deeper topics in Alzheimer's disease, which will probably make a lot more sense now if you've already listened to them. But if you haven't, I will absolutely reference those all at the end of this episode. So check it out, and you can learn, hopefully, a lot more about Alzheimer's disease and what it means to either have it or to be at risk for it. Welcome, everyone. Straight from a Scientist podcast here. Connor Wander, specifically talking to you, and I'm talking with Maya Gostyla, who has been on the show several times before, actually. If you want to learn more about her, as I'm sure you will after this episode, her intro episode was episode 11, and then we also talked in episode 13, so you can check that out as well, but we'll probably mention those. Maya, thank you for coming on the show again.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah, really excited to have you talk. So we've had tons of questions on Alzheimer's disease, and this is going to be like an Alzheimer's frequently asked questions, Alzheimer's fact. But first, let's catch up. You are starting at UCSD in just a couple days, you just told me. That's really exciting. You're going to be a graduate student there.
I am. Yeah. The program starts about a month now, but I'm moving out there early just to get settled. And there's like a neuroscience boot camp thing that I'm participating in there. So yeah, it should be a fun time. I'll be in the biomedical science program there, which is kind of a broad umbrella program, but they have a specialization for neurological diseases that I'm planning to go into and stay in kind of the Alzheimer's, Parkinson's family of disease realm.
Yeah, I do like those umbrella programs because they give you the chance to branch out if you're not 100% certain. This is kind of a trainee focused little spat here, but I like them because they give you that option to just be creative with your science. And if you wanted, you could do a cancer lab, like a plant biology lab, and then a neurodegeneration lab. But if you also know what you want, you get to try out 3 or 4 different labs within that field too, so you know what the best fit is. I think that's really good for graduate students who don't necessarily know where the initial step is.
Yeah, I agree. In this case, I had gotten offers from this program and also the neuroscience department program at the same school. And so that was a big part of my decision, was the fact that I like umbrella programs and I think they're really useful for students.
A lot of people say that you like waste that first year rotating, but for most students, I think the first year is kind of not necessarily a waste, but you don't get a whole lot of productive data out of it anyways. So that's kind of a moot point. That first year of experience is just kind of getting used to being your own boss and all of that. But
yeah, and I honestly wouldn't want to commit to a lab without a rotation first anyway. You never know if the PI is just a huge jerk or the lab dynamics bad or something. It's good to have a little trial run.
Yeah, it is really like 1 year of kind of dating several labs and then finally settling down with whoever you think is really a good fit, both in the research and the environment department. So anyways, Maya, for those listening, runs the allscience.wordpress.com. I always forget wordpress.org or .com. But then, your blog is awesome. I always go there to kind of, if there's a news story that breaks, generally within like a week or two, I feel like you've turned around on it and like given a really good layman explanation. And I've sent it to like friends and family who asked me about this thing that cropped up in the news. and need a little more in-depth explanation that I don't have the time necessarily, or or the communication skills sometimes to really put it in language that they can understand. So highly recommend that resource for people who are interested, and we can also plug your socials at the end. But
sure.
So we can go ahead and get into some of the questions here. I have the Google Doc open. I sourced it to Twitter, but I'm going back to the original one just because I added some stuff to the original one. So people want to know, what are the first signs of Alzheimer's disease? Now, Alzheimer's disease, brief introduction, it's a really just a terrible neurodegenerative disorder. Neurodegenerative being the kind of key component of it. Neurons are dying in Alzheimer's disease, and they're falling apart. Their connections, which are called synapses, aren't working properly. And this manifests itself in a huge host of memory problems and cognitive disorders. The people have trouble keeping track of time. They have trouble remembering their loved ones and their faces, and they get lost commonly. And there's a ton of quality of life detriments that can happen due to the disease. As far as what are the first signs of Alzheimer's disease, Maya, could you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, this is definitely something I think that varies a lot by person, especially because the early signs, you often don't know it's Alzheimer's yet, so they could just be confused with just, as we get older, we also have certain cognitive issues. We become a little bit more forgetful. And so I think the first are frequently missed, or even if they are caught, a doctor may not really feel confident in diagnosing you that early. So often you would see things like, getting confused on locations, especially. So like your sense of orientation and direction can be one of the first things to go in Alzheimer's. So maybe if you have always driven the same route to work every day for years, and then suddenly one day you forget how to do it, that's kind of a red flag that goes beyond normal cognitive aging. Other things like you can become kind of disorganized. Some people, this may manifest in physical disorganization, like their house may become kind of a wreck. It can also be financial. They may not be keeping good financial records. They may even be making poor financial decisions and, kind of losing their ability to make good decisions and rational decisions in that realm. So yeah, it really varies a lot by person. It's basically any kind of cognitive issue that starts to go beyond just, normal cognitive aging and actually interfere a lot with your day-to-day life.
I think that's a really important statement there. Normal cognitive aging. So the aging brain does kind of lose its capacity for some of these functions just over time. I mean, it's inevitable. Things age, things break down, and you're not always going to be able to renew or regenerate the brain, especially. And so that does result in some sort of disorderly conduct, if you will, within the brain. Now, some of the stuff you're talking about, like, I'm very disorganized myself. Luckily, you can't see what's behind me, but it's kind of a mess sometimes. And that brings me to one of the questions actually my friends asked me today, which was, if you are someone who you have memory problems, should you really be worried about Alzheimer's disease? Now, if you're a young person, you have some memory issues, compared to your peers, everyone comparing themselves to someone else can be kind of very subjective. But it is important to note that some of the first signs of Alzheimer's disease are those early problems that can manifest before other heavy symptoms set in, right?
Yeah, and as far as I'm aware, there's not a strong link between your memory when you're really young, like in your 20s or 30s, and your risk of Alzheimer's. But if you get into maybe more like your 40s and 50s, Alzheimer's certainly can start to manifest in those stages, especially if you have one of the more early onset varieties of the disease. So that's at that point, maybe you should start paying more attention, talking with your doctor about any memory issues you're experiencing. Or if you are younger and you feel like you're concerned about your memory, it's always a good idea to bring it up with your doctor anyway. There are certainly a lot of other things that could be interfering with your cognition, whether it's a tumor or, minor seizure disorder. So, it's probably not Alzheimer's related when you're that young, but it certainly could be something else to get checked out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just in general, you want to compare these things over time within yourself and not compare to other people, because you don't necessarily know what's going on anyone else's mind anyways. So people get scared about that, I think, a lot. And I think one of the important things to me is to not stress. Do what you can, but don't stress about what you can't control, right? Because that chronic stress can actually make Alzheimer's disease worse. So
certainly.
On the subject of normal cognitive aging, so one of the big questions is, why does Alzheimer's affect the elderly and not others? And why is it such an age-related disorder? So there's this idea of normal and pathological aging, where normal aging is just inevitable, happens to everyone, but pathological aging happens to a smaller percentage of the population, and the effects are much, much more severe. Now, Alzheimer's is an age-related disorder, so the people who are getting it are typically in their 70s or 80s, or like you said, some of the early onsets, even in their 50s, which is, really scary. But it represents only like 1% to 2% of the population, if I'm right. And those are familial. People have these mutations, and you can get gene sequence for them like really, really fast. So a lot of these technologies are coming out. People can kind of predict their risk, which I think is going to help a lot of people. What's your take on like the age-related part of Alzheimer's disease? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it seems like Alzheimer's kind of falls into a category of diseases where it's not so much that it's not necessarily tied to the process of aging, although it certainly could be. I think there's a bit of a debate on that. But I think the general consensus seems to be more just that it's something that's going to happen eventually, and just the older you get, the more time there's been for these kind of risk factors to accumulate. So you've had potentially more years of unhealthy habits, if you haven't been exercising, if you've been smoking, if you've had a lot of stress in your life. Just kind of the older you get, the more those things build up. And in terms of build up also in the physical sense, these proteins that accumulate in the disease, they take a long time to get to levels that actually become toxic. So a lot of times the accumulation can start 10 to 20 years before you would even start to show symptoms. And so it seems to be, although I think there's still room for debate on this topic, but it's more just a factor of like accumulation rather than necessarily being primarily tied to the biological aging process. But maybe you have other insights on that from the Tau perspective.
No, I mean, that's my perspective as well. It just for background, for people who don't know, I do come from a very Tau heavy background. I come from a tauopathy lab. So the two proteins in Alzheimer's disease, which again, we've talked about a lot in previous podcasts, are beta amyloid and Tau protein. So beta amyloid is thought to be like that first chink in the armor, maybe some people would call it, where that's the first thing to start clumping up and sticking to itself in the brain. And then it causes this whole domino effect, this chain reaction within the brain. And then Tau starts getting aggregated and starts clumping up. And that people think is what kills neurons. Now, amyloid beta can be toxic on its own. Beta amyloid can be toxic on its own, but it also might have protective properties. That was a really fun conversation we had in episode 13. I think the jury's still out as far as I know, right? I haven't seen anything super convincing one way or another.
There's been a lot of like interesting kind of survey data, like, like if you have herpes, you're considerably more likely to get Alzheimer's, for example, but I haven't seen a whole lot of new causative evidence come out. So it seems like we're still kind of unclear on if amyloid beta could be like an anti-infection agent or an anti-cancer agent. So yeah, it's an interesting theory, but I'm waiting for people to start researching it more. I'm very curious.
Yeah, the strongest evidence for amyloid beta being actually protective and something that we kind of need to keep around, like a necessary evil, if you will, for me was that aducanumab recently failed in clinical trials. So that's an anti-amyloid antibody. So it's an antibody people would infuse, and that would get rid of the amyloid beta systemically, potentially in the brain. There were some questions on whether it was getting into the brain in the first place, which is kind of a bad thing to happen in a clinical trial, but I'm not going to touch that right now. I'm a gamer, so I come at this from kind of a gaming perspective, and I gamify almost everything in my life. So I like to think of like the aging component to Alzheimer's disease. It's you have a health bar, right, for your brain, and every time you do something maybe not so smart, like bash your head into a wall, get in a car accident, so obviously some of these things are out of people's control. So traumatic brain injuries, like you said, smoking, other drugs of abuse, alcohol abuse, even though people in the United States don't really think of that as a major drug. And then, unhealthy eating habits, obesity. And then with this infection hypothesis of amyloid beta, infections, peripheral infections, or getting the flu, even herpes, like you said. So there are all these things that can take health points out of your brain's health bar, and at some point it hits this critical threshold where it really can't keep up with the damage that's hitting it. Radiation would be another source, for example. So for me, every day that you live, you're inevitably going to take damage points, right? You're going to lose a little bit of your health bar, and unless someone lives in a bunker underneath the ground, and that's probably not good for you because of all the stress of dealing with that and like lack of vitamin D, there's really no avoiding it. So it is a terrifying disease, but kind of have to accept that maybe it'll happen.
Yeah. A lot of the theories I've kind of heard lately is, why do some people live to 100 and never get Alzheimer's? And kind of the response from a lot of scientists is that, well, if they live to be 110 or 120, then they would get Alzheimer's. They're kind of just delaying it to the point that they die from something else. And so I don't know whether I entirely believe that, but that is a pretty common view that if you live long enough, you're probably going to end up with Alzheimer's disease or a similar type of dementia.
Exactly. So like following my understanding then, or my simplified understanding, it would be those people have more health points to start with, right? And so they're maybe more resilient. Now there's totally valid research going into what makes those people more resilient, right? Because if we could all be like them, then that's kind of a win for people who aren't so resilient to start with.
Yeah, I agree.
That kind of brings me to, it's a very natural segue to, why are women more at risk for Alzheimer's disease than men? Now, the common explanation that people are going to spout out immediately is, oh, that's just because women live longer, right? That's true. While that is true that women live longer than men, about 5 years on average, that's not the whole story. You put out a great blog post on that, like I said.
Yeah, so this is a topic that's always been really interesting to me, and I have a lot of women in my life who are very worried about the risk of Alzheimer's. The rates kind of vary, but it's generally to be about twice as high of a risk if you're female than if you're male. And yeah, there's a couple of reasons for that. Based on the research I was doing for that article, it seemed like one of the biggest drivers we think is this gene called ApoE, which is essentially the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. So having a certain version of this gene called ApoE4 can increase your risk of Alzheimer's pretty substantially. I think if you have 2 copies, it's something like 15% higher than someone who doesn't have 2 copies. Now, keep in mind that gene, even though it's 15% higher, it's definitely not the biggest thing overall that influences your risk. But in terms of genetics, that's the strongest risk factor. And it seems that the ApoE4 allele is a stronger risk factor in women than in men. I don't remember the exact numbers on this, but for men, it wasn't actually 15 times higher. If you had 2 copies, it was something smaller. And we don't entirely know why that is. That's still a pretty active and interesting area of research, especially because ApoE is also involved in things like cholesterol and heart disease, which affect men and women differently. So it's kind of an interesting area that people are working on. And there's also some interesting theories that in addition to the influence of ApoE, there may be some influence from hormones as well. So during the aging process, we all kind of lose our sex hormones that peak after puberty. And for men, it's a very gradual loss in testosterone. But for women, we experience menopause, which is a lot more abrupt. It happens over a period of just like 5-ish years typically. And so there's also some people who think that really abrupt drop in estrogen and progesterone can also disrupt women's brain to make them more likely to get Alzheimer's disease. So I don't think we've entirely figured out that mystery yet, but those 2 factors seem to be a big part of it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, some of the new studies that are coming out. I had a great talk with Dr. Roberto Diaz-Brinton from that AD Fast Track conference I was telling you about. And she basically broke it down and said, look, it's like women are going through reverse puberty almost. Like the changes that are happening in the brain are almost like inverse puberty. And something that dramatic happening in your midlife has to impact the brain profoundly. So for some reason, it doesn't happen in males. I think that's really interesting. And maybe these ApoE4 positive patients can really lead the way in terms of helping us understand it. So the question I get a lot is, why hasn't there been a cure for Alzheimer's disease? And then the follow-up to that, like, how close are we, right?
Yeah. I feel like sometimes people, you see a lot of things on the news or on social media about how like, oh, we're like right on the cusp of curing Alzheimer's, and like we basically cured it, and then like nothing happens, and people are like, what happened? I thought we basically cured it. And I think that can lead to a lot of distrust between the public and research and pharmaceuticals. And so I think this is a good thing to address. I don't want people to think that there's like some secret cure that we're hiding. Like, believe me, if either of us had any information, like we'd be sharing it, and it would benefit us a lot, personally too. It's not like we're like gaining anything via like hiding secrets. So yeah, I think part of it is just that biomedical research is really, really hard. It's just really hard. And a lot of those stories you see on social media are, first of all, usually in mice or rats. probably cured Alzheimer's disease, I don't know, hundreds of times in
Thousands.
mice and rats.
Yeah.
So yeah, and basically every type of cancer has been cured in mice. So like mice are very healthy. Yeah, they're never going to get Alzheimer's. They're fine. And then when those drugs actually get to humans, they almost always fail. It's something like 95 to 98% of Alzheimer's drugs that reach clinical trials will not get FDA approval. Either it won't work, or the side effects will be too dangerous, or oftentimes a combination of both. And so that's a big part of it. It's just that biomedical research is really hard. It's especially for a disease like Alzheimer's that never really naturally occurs in mice. We have to induce it genetically. It's really hard to see if those drugs work at all in humans. And then I think probably the other big part is that there's been kind of a big shift within the past 10 years or so in how we understand Alzheimer's. And so basically all the previous generation of drugs were targeted entirely at amyloid beta, like almost 100% of them.
Yep.
And that's pretty clearly just not worked. There have been so many clinical trials targeting amyloid beta, just like this recent one you mentioned, and oftentimes they don't work and or have very harmful side effects like increased infection, sometimes risk of cancer, things like that. And so I think there's been kind of people putting on the brakes a bit in the research and trying to figure out, okay, why are none of these drugs working? We should have had at least like one success statistically by this point if it was going to be a useful strategy.
Yeah.
And so I think there's kind of a transition happening now where people are trying kind of different strategies, like can we target amyloid beta and tau at the same time, or can we target it at a different point in disease progression or things like that. So that I think is another big driving factor in why it's taken us so long to get to this point, and why it seems like we're always on the cusp of a cure when it hasn't actually reached FDA approval.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're kind of in a midlife crisis, if you will, for the Alzheimer's disease research field. Now, obviously, we're kind of late to the game. We're a little new in the field, but just my perception from all the literature I've read, from the people I've talked to, we've made some pretty chronic mistakes in the past. And I think, Dr. Harry Steinbuch, who I talked to in episode 46, said, we've been funding grants that are the safe bet, right? We've been funding all these scientists who are taking like little itty bitty risks, basically no risks in their grant proposals, and they're not thinking big. They're not thinking of these big ideas that could change the game. And that's just kind of the way our grant economy is wired at the moment. So some things are going to need to give there. There are grant agencies realizing that, and they're moving towards that idea. Like, let's get these big ideas in and let's start working on things that could be a long shot, but might just work. So there is a lot of hope. It looks pretty bleak right now for a lot of people. But I think there is a lot of hope. Like you said, we're taking all of these integrative therapies, we're rethinking animal models, and we're really doing kind of a house cleaning in some of the more iterative processes that we're doing for research.
Yeah, and I think something to keep in mind as well in terms of the timeline is that I highly doubt there's going to just be like a moment where like we've cured Alzheimer's 100%.
Right.
That happens occasionally for diseases, but that's usually not the case. Usually you have kind of increments where you'll have maybe a drug that's approved that treats Alzheimer's like 20% of patients, doesn't work on the rest, or maybe it only works if you give it to people before they start showing symptoms and not after. And so it's probably not just going to be like a sudden breakthrough with nothing you hear beforehand. There's going to be a few drugs that kind of work that, but not that well, before we get to like a full 100% cure for the disease.
And then also because there's definitely different classes of Alzheimer's disease, right? So there's the familial, which we mentioned, it's like 1% to 2% of people, and gene therapies could go a long way to curing the symptoms that they're getting. But for the people who have sporadic Alzheimer's disease, it's called sporadic because we don't really know where it's coming from. That's going to be a much harder nut to crack. And that's the vast majority of patients. So we're going to need like personalized therapies. We're going to need combination therapies, like you said. It's going to be a battle.
Yes, I definitely think if we do see anything called the cure for Alzheimer's in the next few years, it's probably going to be that familial form, just because we have such a deeper understanding of what's actually causing it. We know it's just like these 3 genes, basically.
Yep.
But then during that sporadic condition, which is the much common form of Alzheimer's, is almost certainly, like you said, going to take either some kind of personalized medicine, combination approach. It's going to be a lot more complicated to treat.
And it's important to note that those mutations in the familial Alzheimer's disease are basically what we put into mice to try and cure Alzheimer's, right? Mice, like you said, it's all too important. Mice don't naturally get Alzheimer's disease. So the question is like, why the heck are we using them, right? I get that a lot. If they aren't proper models, then why are we using them at all? And that's a valid question. It's kind of like they're the best tool we have at the moment that's logistically feasible. That's the best explanation I can come up with. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, that's pretty much same thing. Like I know there are some animals that naturally get something similar to Alzheimer's. Like I think some types of dogs can get Alzheimer's like symptoms like pretty close to us. But then again, you have first of all just the ethical issues. So people don't really like the idea of doing research on dogs. It's kind of they're a bit more emotionally attached to them than rodents. Just the expense and logistics of having a laboratory with these often larger and more expensive animals. And so it's been kind of a rough transition to realize that maybe these rodent models that we've used for most other diseases are not going to actually be a useful tool for Alzheimer's.
There is one rodent model, albeit it's a larger rodent, the Daegu, D-E-G-U, sorry. It's like a relative of the chinchilla as far as I know, which one is much larger than a mouse, so you can't fit as many of them in a building as you would want, but also it is really cute, and it takes 5 years to manifest symptoms, and that's how long our PhD is supposed to last, right? So can you imagine, like, you're joining a lab, they're at UCSD, and they're just now, the Daegus are just now being born, and then in 5 years you can test to see if you cured them, and if you didn't, then like how do you publish your paper? So it's a logistical nightmare to not work with mice.
I think the issue with these models that's really maybe interested in it's these issues that are really maybe interested in human organoids. And so essentially human organoids are kind of, you may have heard them called like brains on chips or mini brains in certain situations, where they're basically just like a very simplified small version of whatever organ you're studying, in this case the brain. And they have their own limitations too. Like obviously you don't have, you don't usually have like a circulatory system, there's no blood, there's no immune system. And so it's still very simplified, but you have the advantage of its human cells, in some cases even human cells directly from someone who had Alzheimer's disease. And so I'm kind of hopeful that these new organoid models in combination with our classical rodent models are going to really help us to get a deeper understanding of how our future generation of Alzheimer's drugs are actually going to be working.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm really excited about iPSCs, induced pluripotent stem cells. Basically, you can reverse a skin cell just from someone's sample and make it into a stem cell that can then turn into any cell type you want it to using various factors. These are really exciting, and I'm seeing like grants go and they are being funded really fast. So that's like the next hot topic that I've seen. Is there anything else on the horizon that you've been keeping your eye on?
I think one of the biggest things I've seen push for is to include some kind of model of the immune system in your study. A lot of even like human cell models, they almost never include anything related to the immune system. So the brain has its own resident immune cells called microglia, and even in very simple cell studies, they often would just have neurons and none of the other cells, whereas neurons are actually the minority of cells in the brain. Most cells in the brain are not neurons. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to see how the inclusion of glia and especially immune cells in the brain in these models is going to advance our understanding, especially as we learn too that the mouse immune system is just so different from the human immune system, especially in how it relates to the brain. And I think kind of adding in that extra piece is going to be really interesting and help us to figure out what's actually going on with this disease.
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about it being a neurodegenerative disorder, and I understand the obsession with neurons because obviously, like, we can't walk, talk, or think without neurons. They're vital, obviously, but they are a minority cell population in the brain, right? So you have this thing that's wrecking the whole brain, not really just neurons. Like, there's so much decay going on. And people are just now looking at those other cell types as possible culprits, possible targets for therapy. I have an astrocyte project myself, and I can't talk too much about it yet because we're preparing the manuscript. But and trust me, we will talk about it then. But I think it is gonna be fairly big. It's not gonna cure the disease, sorry everyone, but astrocytes are definitely a crucial component. That's not to ignore microglia. They're of course incredibly important too. So there's a litany of cell types we could go over, but it is incredibly complex, and doing it in a dish, it'll let you answer some questions really, really well, but I don't know that'll be the whole story, unfortunately. So we do need those other immune factors,
right?
I thought it'd be good to go over, like, how do current Alzheimer's disease therapies work. We're talking about all the future of the field, but to let people understand, like, maybe they have a relative who is on current Alzheimer's disease medication. I think one of the two of the top line medications are donepezil, which I commonly mispronounce, and then memantine. So they're two drugs that basically work through two different systems in neurotransmitters. One is acetylcholine, and the other is glutamate. Can you help us break that down?
Yeah, essentially. So there's I think 4 drugs currently on the market in total for Alzheimer's. And as you said, they target these kind of neurotransmitter systems, and notably, they do not target amyloid beta or tau at all.
Right. But they work. They work. At
yes.
least they give you some time. So
yes. So essentially, kind of the idea of these drugs is they're not even intended to be a cure. They're mainly just so Alzheimer's has kind of 3 stages, and the middle phase is the longest phase typically, and it's where people have fairly severe memory loss, but they're not entirely incapacitated. It's a phase where they don't necessarily need hospice care. They can themselves, they can still walk. And so it's kind of the goal of these kinds of drugs is basically extend that middle phase and decrease the length of the end stage. Because the end stage is often when people need round the clock care. It's very physically and emotionally stressful for their caretakers. And essentially what these drugs do is they will mediate your symptoms. So they might treat some, help your mood. Sometimes people with Alzheimer's can get very irritable or very angry. So it can help treat those issues. It can help a little bit with memory, although it's certainly not going to reverse the course of memory loss. It may help to slow it down a bit. So they're kind of essentially, they're really more in a way for the caretaker than for the patient. It's not going to have a huge drastic increase of their quality of life, but it is going to help their caretaker to keep them at home instead of in a hospital or in a nursing home for longer, and kind of just make the disease course a little bit easier to deal with.
Yeah. And I mean, at least we can buy people time, right? So it's not a cure, it's a treatment. People always say, what are these medicines even doing? But they are doing something. They're not useless, but they really only buy time. So that's why people are working on it. Mm-hmm. We basically answered a lot of these questions, but we'll go kind of back to the basics again. Why does the brain decay in Alzheimer's disease? Like, why are neurons degenerating? Why is the brain falling apart? We mentioned beta amyloid. We mentioned tau, which I'm a big proponent of tau causing the damage, but I don't think that's the whole story either. So what are kind of the other things you mentioned? The immune system, is that having an active role?
Yeah, there's kind of answers, like a lot of answers to this question. There's a lot of kind of going wrong at the same time. So as you said, there's these two kind of toxic proteins that build up in the brain. That's certainly a big factor in the disease. The immune system is kind of going haywire. Your immune system already tends to get a bit weaker as you get older. You're more prone to infections. And there's some evidence that in some cases, your immune system within the brain can also sometimes get hyperactive and overreact to certain infections, and that can be as well. There are other things like your ability to use glucose or sugar for energy decreases with aging and with Alzheimer's. And so essentially they just can't get enough energy to function. That's partly why some people are interested in researching ketogenic diets for Alzheimer's, where you're essentially replacing glucose with ketones, an alternative energy source, so that your neurons still have some source of energy to function.
Like a backup.
I wouldn't, I wouldn't really start consuming a ton of coconut oil yet, or avocados, but it is interesting research. It's still very early on. So it's kind of almost like a perfect storm. Just all the systems are breaking down at the same time, and your brain just can't handle it.
Yeah, it's kind of an all of the above scenario is how I view it as well, this holistic approach. And for some people, it might be A, B, and C, you know what I mean? But not D. It might be some different combination depending on who you are and the things that you've been exposed to. So just a side note, I do love the ketogenic diet. I know it's a very fad diet, so I recommend anyone who's interested in it, please do your research first, because doing it wrong can really hurt you. But at least for me, I'm not doing it for to avoid Alzheimer's or anything. I just feel better and I enjoy it, and I tend to like the foods that I'm eating on it anyways. So it's not for everyone. But I will advocate for that. I will never stop. Where does the brain decay start in Alzheimer's disease? This is kind of a point of contention to some people between the amyloid camp and the tau camp. As for my perspective, I know that tau tends to start in the brainstem, which is kind of the inner, the deepest, darkest parts of your brain. Maybe some people might say it's parts that controls some of your basic functions. But amyloid beta crops up in more of the outer shell of the brain, right?
Yeah. Classically, the two areas people pay the most attention to in terms of the early phases of Alzheimer's are the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. And so the hippocampus is basically your memory center. All of your formation of new memories and recalling old memories all go through the hippocampus. And so that's one of the first areas where you start seeing amyloid beta accumulation. And then you have the frontal cortex, which is essentially your decision making and logic part of your brain. So this is where, if you start to notice that someone has issues with organization or with making good decisions, and even sometimes like mood related things like controlling their mood, that's where the frontal cortex would come in. And also a third area that people don't always talk about a lot, but it is also one of the early areas to decay in Alzheimer's, is the olfactory bulb, which
Right.
controls your sense of smell. There's some research that people start to lose their ability to smell pretty early on in Alzheimer's, and that may help contribute to weight loss in Alzheimer's. If you can't smell,
Mm.
food starts to taste very bad to you.
Yeah.
And so there's some interesting research on if people are losing interest in food, that could be a sign to get them tested for a lot of different conditions, including Alzheimer's, because anosmia, the loss of smell, is kind of an early warning sign as well. I've heard anecdotally that one of the first smells you lose is the smell of peanut butter. I
Right.
don't have any data to back that up, but I've heard several
Same.
people tell me that they like can't smell peanut butter anymore. So that's kind of another interesting area that people don't talk about as much. It tends to decay pretty early in the disease.
Yeah, I brought that up in lab meeting, the peanut butter test, and no one refuted me on it. But yeah, no one had data for it. So it's this kind of thing that's making the rounds. It does make sense, though, that you would maybe kind of lose olfactory function due to that. Now, we know in mice, at least, and this gets to what might be the differences between mice and humans, but mice have new neurons that constantly come in and replace their olfactory bulb. Now, that could be a big difference between mice and humans, right? Because mice are constantly having to adjust to new smells, to forage and find their way around their environment. Their eyesight really isn't that great compared to humans. And so they have this kind of train of new neurons constantly flooding into the olfactory bulb that potentially feed it plasticity, basically make it more malleable and more able to adapt to new smells and kind of format their environment for themselves. But the hippocampus can also generate new neurons, and that does happen in humans. That was recently a big point of contention in the scientific world, but I think it's been pretty nailed shut that we do have the capability to grow new neurons in the hippocampus, even into very, very late ages, like 70s, 80s. They were looking at these patient sample brains, and they had plenty of new neurons. The people with Alzheimer's disease had far, far less. And it's a question I often get, like, we're losing all these neurons in Alzheimer's disease. Is there any way to replace them? Can we basically repair the brain right from the inside? And theoretically, yes, because we can generate new neurons, but unfortunately those newborn neurons are far fewer in number in an Alzheimer's disease patient. So it's kind of like all systems are failing, right?
Yeah, and the other issue too is that even if we could increase that rate of neurogenesis, there's no way to know whether those neurons would actually have the same connections as the old ones, because it's
Right.
not just the number of neurons, it's how they're connected to each other that determines your memories and your personality and all that. And so it's certainly possible that we would find a way to increase neurogenesis, but whether that would have any impact on patients' memories and their general function, it's hard to say.
And if they form basically aberrant connections, improper connections, it could actually be worse for the patient, right? So
Yeah,
it's
certainly.
something we need to tread carefully in, definitely. One question, can you get AD under 50? We kind of already answered that. That would be the more familial cases. And then certainly with this, all of this news about TBI from, football, professional football players, and even like the UFC. I know there's a big fight recently, and it's hard to not think about that when people are taking all these blows to the head. Some of these people are getting dementia-like symptoms early on in their years. Now, that's not necessarily Alzheimer's disease, but that's something important to note. Are there any other examples of, other than like familial Alzheimer's disease, for example, that people would get it so early?
Yeah, so definitely, as you said, the concussions and things like football and boxing probably will not give classical Alzheimer's, but it'll essentially give you something similar to Alzheimer's,
Right.
accumulation of tau in the brain, and it's a really serious, often deadly condition. But other things can either increase your risk of Alzheimer's or kind of make it happen earlier in your life. So, for example, even subconcussive blows, so blows to your head that don't give you a concussion but are still maybe enough to make you see some stars a little bit, or just a hard blow to the head. Something, for example, they would teach us about this. I play soccer, and if you don't teach kids how to hit the ball with their head properly, you can get these subconcussive blows.
Mm.
And those things can greatly increase your risk of Alzheimer's as well. It kind of just basically causes swelling in the brain, and even though that's temporary, that seems to increase your overall lifetime risk of Alzheimer's and also other brain diseases as well. Other source of head injury, actually, I think the most common source of concussions is car accidents. And it's not always possible to avoid car accidents, but wearing your seatbelt is a great way to reduce your risk of concussions. So always wear your seatbelt when you're driving. Make sure if you have kids, make sure they are in proper restraints, like, booster seats in the back seat if they need to be, or in rear facing car seats. And a third thing that I think people don't talk about a lot is falling in elderly people. And so a lot of us, if you have an elderly relative, that falling is a big risk for breaking bones, leaving them in the hospital. But it's also a really big risk for dementia and for Alzheimer's in particular. So if you have a family member or someone who is either living alone, especially, or just in a place where they're at risk of falling, like taking steps to reduce their falling risk, things like the lifts to take them upstairs, or installing grippers on the floor from slipping, those can also brain as well as protect them from breaking bones.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and something that people don't often think of is, they're so close to the edge of risk, and we should really be protecting the elderly population, our grandparents and those, even our parents, kind of as they approach it. So another question that was right in there: does Alzheimer's disease impact sexual activity? So I know it impairs all sorts of quality of life effects, but I actually don't know much about this one topic.
Yeah, but this isn't something I know a whole lot about either. I know kind of anecdotally, it can obviously, and any kind of thing that affects your brain is going to have an impact on your romantic and your sex life. But it seems from talking to people in homes to be a very individual experience. I've talked to people who complained about their spouse becoming hypersexual or sometimes inappropriately sexual with dementia and with Alzheimer's, and I've seen the opposite. It seems to be a very individual experience, and I don't know that there have been a whole lot of studies on that, unfortunately.
I will say, I have heard that, and again, I don't have tons of data on this, that other bodily functions that you might associate, like urination, some people lose control, right? And so they start having accidents as well. So you can imagine all of these things tying together. You're not really going to necessarily have that drive if you're constantly embarrassed or worried about embarrassment. So, I mean, it is, just terrible for quality of life. People have immense problems. So it's kind of across the board, again, kind of an all the above or combinations for different people.
Yeah, and it brings in the issue of consent too. A lot of people have concerns about, is it even ethical to have sex with someone who has dementia? Can they really consent or say no? And so that's kind of a whole other can of worms that people have to consider, and it can be really difficult to navigate.
If they don't know who you are, exactly, if they're having trouble remembering, yeah, that's a really big concern. Other things, we kind of covered all of these. What types of activities are shown to reduce the spread or the onset of Alzheimer's disease? So we mentioned exercise, definitely. Episode 46, again, Dr. Steinbush and I were talking about group exercise specifically was the most protective and had like the biggest component in terms of increasing your basically cognitive capacity and abilities. What other things would you recommend for people?
Yeah, group exercise makes a lot of sense that would be better than just exercising alone, because social interaction is also a big part of reducing your risk for Alzheimer's. So that could be going to exercise classes in a group. It could be getting involved with social media. It could be getting a pet, really whatever works for you as a person. Other things, diet is probably the biggest thing that will influence your risk of Alzheimer's, and also just lots of other diseases, diabetes, heart attacks, basically everything.
Yep.
And so the kind of mantra that I've heard is, if it's good for your body, it's good for your brain, especially if it's good for your heart, because most of the blood supply in your body goes to your brain. And so anything that you associate with a healthy heart, so things like not eating too much cholesterol, not eating too much saturated fat or too much sugar, trying to basically eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, not a lot of red meats, nothing super out of the ordinary. It's not going to be like, go on like a peanut only diet or something crazy. It's just kind of the stuff you've been hearing your whole life. Yeah. And then other common health things too, like, get enough sleep. Sleep is extremely important for your brain. Getting enough exercise, both cardiovascular and strength exercises, both important. Things to keep your mind active. I don't know that there's any evidence that things like crosswords or Sudoku really decreases the risk of Alzheimer's. The better things seem to be more either for social interaction, because that greatly stimulates your brain, exactly, or even taking classes, like especially a lot of community colleges, at least in my area, they have free or reduced cost classes for elderly people. So that's a great way to keep your brain active as well. So yeah, essentially just kind of the advice you've probably heard from your doctor all the time. It's not anything super revolutionary, just be overall healthy, and that'll greatly reduce your risk of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I think most, if not all of those things really affect the immune system too, which is this burgeoning area of research that we've been talking about. So exercise is a huge immune booster, and you got to feed your immune system with the proper nutrients and tools to really get it to be properly active and working for you. So again, the diet, and one thing you mentioned was like learning new things. Absolutely. There's a lot of data supporting that people who know a lot of languages are somehow protected against Alzheimer's disease if you look across associational studies. So just kind of a use it or lose it mentality some people have with Alzheimer's disease, and that it maybe the brain is kind of like a muscle, and your body too, of course. So if you're not using it, if you're not keeping it active and well tuned, then you're going to have these problems possibly. One other thing, drugs of abuse and Alzheimer's disease. Tons of new studies coming out against alcohol, which is probably America's favorite drug of abuse. It's really not great for your brain. I think everyone knows it. Then they wake up with a hangover and they feel like their brain is going to jump out of their head and splat against the wall. But the data really does support it. And I don't mean to shame people. I understand there is inherent value in having a great night with friends, and the amount of laughter you get, we can't ever quantify that, right? Like, I don't know if you drink, Maya, but if you have a couple drinks with people and you loosen up and you have a ton of fun, maybe that's worth it. I don't know. I'll never be able to say, but definitely binge drinking is probably never going to be worth it.
Yeah, certainly. Like, you sometimes see the studies like, oh, red wine will protect you against Alzheimer's or against cancer. Right. But the amounts in those will be like usually 1 to 2 glasses per day. And so basically any kind of binging is not going to protect from any, it's going to greatly increase your risk of those diseases. Even if you're young, it isn't, it's usually considered to be worse for your health if you do it when you're older, but even when you're young, you're not immune. And that's a great point to bring up, because a lot of people don't talk about alcohol as drug of abuse. But if based on the studies in the Alzheimer's fields and in other diseases, it seems that it's as bad, if not worse, than other things that you think of as abuse, like smoking.
Yeah, exactly. And, kind of then there's also potential for brain damage that comes with heavy alcohol abuse that you see, of course, drunk driving and other issues. It's got a long rap sheet, really. Now, I will say that there have been mouse studies that showed basically early, it's a model of teen binge drinking in mice, basically. And we just talked about how mice and humans aren't directly comparable, but they do give us some insight, right? So in this model, if a mouse drinks a ton of alcohol when it's young, but then it exercises, it ends up much, much healthier, at least in the brain, than a mouse that drank a ton of alcohol, and then didn't exercise. So you can recover some of that damage potentially by living a healthy life in other areas. I'm not advocating, living a Jersey Shore style lifestyle or anything, but maybe you can heal yourself up a little bit by staying active.
Yes, certainly. Better idea is to not binge drink and also still exercise. But if you know that you have some kind of bad habits, you should take extra steps to kind of compensate as best as you can by adopting habits.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So other drugs, I mean, antidepressants, I think the jury's still out on those, because while there are some associational studies basically showing that people who have been on antidepressants are at higher risk, that might just be because their brain architecture is such that they're both vulnerable to they're vulnerable to depression and Alzheimer's, which has a mood disorder component to it. So those might be one and the same, really. It doesn't necessarily mean that antidepressants cause the disease. At least I've not seen that.
Yeah, I think I agree. And there's also the fact that if you have depression, you're also less likely to exercise, you're less likely to seek out social interactions, and those are other big risk factors for the disease.
Very true.
I think one thing to note since we're talking about this family of drugs is antipsychotic drugs, or also anti-anxiety drugs. I had a question about this from somebody who I know on Facebook. And there's kind of one of the big risks of people not being diagnosed clinically with Alzheimer's is that they may be given antipsychotic medications if they have an episode where maybe they get lost, end up in the hospital, something like that. And this is a real problem. There's a lot of research that antipsychotics are really bad for people who have Alzheimer's. They can make their symptoms a lot worse. They can even make their progression faster. And so this is something to note, that antipsychotics are probably not going to give you Alzheimer's, but they're very bad to give to someone who has the disease. And for that reason, I think it's really important for people to make sure that for themselves or for others they know to actually get that clinical diagnosis. Because if they end up in a hospital, they may be given a drug that is actually going to make them worse.
Absolutely. So how do people go and get a clinical diagnosis? You just go and talk to your doctor and say, hey, I'm having these memory issues. I talked a little bit in my previous podcast. Actually, it's not released on our end yet. People can go and check out the Blunt Report at Blunt Report, I think, the Blunt Report podcast. And we basically talked about all the different ways that people get diagnosed. We actually never mentioned this earlier in our podcast today. So I know the memory tests are really the front line. Now they're coming out with blood tests. There's PET scans even. What are the other things that are accessible now for people that you know of?
Yeah. So as you said, usually the step is going to be just with a regular paper and pencil memory test. There's a couple of different of that. And what I recommend to people as they're first going in for this test is to always have someone go with you, because it's very common for a spouse or a child or a caretaker to be able to tell the doctor things that you just may not have noticed that you're doing that's different. Right. Even just small things like, you're putting silverware away in the wrong drawer, like things that you may not notice, but they can tell the doctor and that'll help them. And from there, if you have some signs of cognitive impairment on that test, that can go into the more biological type tests. So there's kind of an array that people can give you. Like, as you said, there's a PET scan, which is basically like a brain glucose scan. Essentially, that's not how to explain it. It's seeing how much glucose your brain is using.
Like how active parts of your brain are, basically. Yeah,
exactly. And there's other things you can do. Some people will get a spinal tap, and they'll look at the levels of amyloid beta in your spinal fluid. There's blood tests. There's even some people are trying to develop tests where they look into your eye, and the retina is actually like part of the brain, and so you can look and see how much amyloid beta is on the retina and use that to figure out if you might have Alzheimer's. But one thing to know about these tests is there's still actually no conclusive way to 100% diagnose Alzheimer's while you're still alive. The only way to know completely is to do a postmortem after death and to look in the brain. And part of the reason for that is because, number one, a lot of people don't just have Alzheimer's. It's very common to have Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, or Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, or something else. And so it can be very hard to tease apart what is actually causing these conditions. And all those conditions can have very similar symptoms, both in terms of what you experience day to day and what the pathology looks like in the brain. And so you can take these tests to get a good sense of how likely you are that whatever this person's experiencing is Alzheimer's. But in fact, it's really hard to know. And even the best doctors often can't diagnose it with complete certainty.
Yeah, so here's a conceptual question. Is it worth delineating at all, right? Like, if we don't really know for certain, and some people who kind of randomly at this break point get tossed into bucket A versus bucket B, and they get completely different drugs potentially. Generally, they're not actually completely different drugs. As a conceptual question, is it worth delineating, in your opinion? Again, this is not speculative.
It's kind of hard to say. As you said, it's kind of a question of how much does it matter to this person's day-to-day life if they are diagnosed with Alzheimer's versus a different type of dementia. One of the advantages to me is that a lot of clinical trials will require an actual diagnosis of X disease, whatever it is they're trying to treat. Right. And so if you're interested in getting involved with experimental drugs and seeing if any of them work for you, you do usually need to have that clinical diagnosis, and you need to be pretty confident about it. Or your doctor anyway has to be pretty confident about whatever they're diagnosing you with. And there are other things as well, like they can give you a better sense of the time course of the disease and what you might expect. So, for example, a lot of the motor issues that you see in Parkinson's disease are not very common in Alzheimer's, and vice versa.
Right.
But for other people, they may not want to know the full details of their diagnosis. It's also a valid viewpoint. It be necessarily affect your day-to-day very much. It's more something that helps with planning for the future and helping caretakers manage their symptoms.
Yeah, and that's kind of my similar train of thought for all of these genetic tests that are coming out. So we know all of these Alzheimer's risk factors now. You can go and get your ApoE genotype tested. You can get, your TREM2 variant, which is another Alzheimer's disease risk factor, tested. And these things come out in a panel, which a gene counselor can go over with you. But not everyone wants to know, right? It's sometimes you're better off not knowing in a way, because you won't be stressed about it. And that stress can kind of turn into this vicious cycle too. So, these are all very, very personal decisions. All we can do is really give people the information. So,
yeah, that's partly the reason why I sometimes advise people against going with these tests like Ancestry DNA or
Sure.
23andMe
Yeah.
For specifically disease testing, because that doesn't give you access to an in-person genetic counselor. And genetic counselors do really important work in helping people to understand what their testing results actually mean. Whereas opposed to if you just get something in the mail that says, hey, you have 15 times the risk of Alzheimer's disease, you might not know what to do with that information. Like what we'd like you to do is for you to say, okay, my risk is higher. I need to start taking some steps to reduce my risk. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what happens to a lot of people is they say, I'm going to get Alzheimer's anyway. I
Yep.
don't need to like do anything. Like it's inevitable, kind of give up. And that's not true at all. Most of your risk, in fact, it's something like 70% of your risk is caused by lifestyle and environmental and not by genetics. And so it can be really dangerous to give people the impression that their fate is sealed. And so I think if you are someone who wants to know genetic risk is for Alzheimer's or really any disease, it can be really worth it, especially if you have access to insurance that'll cover it, to do that testing in an actual genetic clinic and have a genetic counselor explain the results to you.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to give people like a fatalist or defeatist mentality. And unfortunately, that's what happens. You kind of misunderstand the risk factors. They're risk multipliers, right? And not a single one of these mutations will guarantee that you'll get Alzheimer's disease. Well, other than maybe the familial ones, if you have a combination of them. But I don't think that happens in real life necessarily. We pretty much covered all of the frequently asked questions. I had a few questions for you, Maya, about kind of where you see the state of Alzheimer's disease. And again, we did cover these in brief, but we talked about what amyloid beta is doing, beta amyloid in the brain. It's clumping up. It might have an immune protective function. That's kind of like maybe the cutting edge as far as I can see. What else are you excited about in the field right now? Like when you're reading, or like what's the thing that no news has come out about it conclusively, but you're really waiting for that paper to drop?
Yeah. One of the areas I'm really interested in, which is actually partly why I chose my program, is the role of genomic mosaicism in Alzheimer's. And there's one lab in particular, Gerald Chun at UCSD, who studies this, which is why I'm really excited to rotate there. And essentially, genomic mosaicism is this idea that you're taught in basic biology class that the DNA sequence in every cell is exactly the same throughout your body. And that's like pretty much true for most of your cells. They're usually pretty much the same DNA sequence, except in the brain reason, and a couple other tissues in the body.
Yeah.
There's been really evidence that neurons, pretty much each one has its own unique genome. It may have copies of entire chromosomes or deleted chromosomes or missing pieces or extra pieces, which that in itself is just fascinating to me, just as an idea that each neuron has its own genome, and which is something we've really only had the technology to look at the genomes of individual cells for the past maybe 5 years.
Right.
Before that, it was only possible to sequence them in like big groups. And so there's a lot of interesting research now that this genomic mosaicism is related to Alzheimer's and possibly to other neurodegenerative conditions. We don't exactly know how that's working. There's kind of some interesting ideas that maybe this gene APP, which is involved in Alzheimer's, can be disrupted, or maybe some of the presenilins. There's not a whole lot of conclusive data on that yet. It's still very new and still kind of coming. But that's an area I'm really keeping my eye on to see if that could be a useful target for us to understand the disease and possibly design new therapies.
Is that kind of your best bet right now for what to target in Alzheimer's disease? If you had to pick one, or maybe your top 3.
Yeah, honestly, I think the idea of picking one target is not productive.
Kind of ridiculous.
I think people like to have their camps like, oh, I'm a tau person, amyloid beta person, but really it's almost certainly going to be things targeting multiple things at the same time, and it's just going to vary based on the person. So I think, my bet is going to be probably something targeting amyloid beta combined with something that targets tau, and maybe something that's also targeting one of these other factors like genomic mosaicism, like the immune system, like glucose metabolism. And all those things are going to need to work together if we're going to have a good shot at treating the disease.
Yeah, I mean, when people ask, like, if you had to pick one or whatever, I would say probably the immune system, just because it touches every other part of the brain. So it's kind of a cheating answer if you were to say just one. But yeah, it's got to be a holistic approach. And that kind of brings me to this personalized medicine question, which I think, everyone's been talking personalized medicine in every field, cancer, heart disease, obesity, you name it, basically. I mean, we have the tools now. We have the data. The question is, how do we organize it and kind of basically put the puzzle pieces together, right? Because we can get so much data on a particular person, we just don't know what it all means yet. And gathering that along with lifestyle, could go a long way. Now this is very, very far in the future, so I don't want to get anyone's hopes too far up with that. But I do think it is coming, and it's probably sooner than we think. But we'll see how the medical community is able to adopt it, because I mean, doctors are overworked as it is. So
yeah, I definitely think personalized medicine is kind of the future for a lot of these geriatric diseases that have very complex causes. It's probably going to need to just be a treatment designed for every patient, kind of like is already happening with cancer in a lot of cases. Now it's starting to move into other diseases. And I think especially for Alzheimer's, where it seems like there's a lot of different things that can cause it in different people, it's really important to know what the trigger was for that individual person. So one example that comes to mind is there was one study. It was pretty small. It's not anything super conclusive, but they essentially had a group of patients who they all tested positive for this one particular type of brain infection. I think it was a bacteria, but I'm not positive about that. And they basically found that if they got rid of this brain infection, then their symptoms that had appeared to be Alzheimer's kind of went away. They recovered their memory. And there's kind of debate on, well, did they actually have Alzheimer's, or was that just the symptoms of this infection? It's like what causes what? It's an example of like if you the trigger for what was causing amyloid beta and tau to accumulate in the first place, it's possible that if you treat that and then go in with your anti-amyloid beta, anti-tau drugs, that's going to actually be the effect. So it's figuring out what is causing them in the first place in that individual patient that you need to figure out first before you can do anything else.
Yeah, you kind of lagged out a bit there, but basically you're saying treat as far down the route as we can go, right? With the disease cascade.
We've definitely been acting like amyloid beta just starts to accumulate randomly by itself, and we need to treat that. I think the general consensus is probably something even more upstream and to be focusing our new research on.
Yeah, I saw a poster at SFN. I actually mentioned this in the last podcast that hasn't dropped. I'm really excited about the idea. I mean, not necessarily excited. I'm terrified that there could be infectious particles all over our brains, right? Bacteria, viruses, fungi, and they're basically finding these particles in postmortem brains from human and mouse samples, and the implications are huge, right? If that's what's actually causing the initial damage, then it makes sense that amyloid beta would clump up, because we know, at least in a petri dish, amyloid beta will kind of seek out these same types of particles. So it makes sense that it would clump up, and at the center of these amyloid beta plaques, these like sticky clumps, we find viruses and bacteria and fungi, what have you. I think that's
kind of this emerging like field of the brain microbiome, which I think 10 years ago the whole concept of that did not exist at all.
Would get you laughed out of any lab meeting.
Yeah, it's like horrifying to even think about there being like all this stuff living in your brain, but there's first of all of us probably have herpes. Basically all of us have herpes in our brains. A lot of us have other bacterial infections that get into the brain. Even fungi, a lot of brains can live there. And so there's kind of a whole system happening in our brains, and we need to take all of them into consideration as well as we start to think about what is the trigger for neurodegenerative conditions.
Yeah, and that's why I hammer the immune system home when anyone asks me, like, if there's one thing you can do, I'm like, boost your immune system, however you do it, whether it's you need a better diet or you need more exercise or better sleep, right? Because the glymphatic system, which is like the waste clearance system of the brain, was basically just recently discovered. In terms of humanity's understanding of the disease, it's practically yesterday that we discovered, oh, there's this whole waste clearance system in the brain. And when we're talking about a disease that the hallmarks are a bunch of protein junk that accumulates, that's going to be important. So
yes.
Very excited about glymphatic system as well. Might be doing some research on that later, but I don't know. We'll see where my my graduate career goes. I feel like
lymphatic has to be involved in some way for sure, just because it's the way that normally amyloid beta should get cleared out of your brain if you're healthy,
Right.
And the fact that it really only is activated when you're sleeping, and the fact that sleep is already, so closely tied to Alzheimer's, just makes a whole lot of intuitive sense to me.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe that we haven't figured it out sooner, but hey, I mean, better late than never. Maya, it's been awesome. First, let's, I guess, plug your socials and all that. Where can people find you? Where can people hear more from you? Because I'm sure they'll want to.
Yeah, sure. So my blog is all science, ALZSCIENCE, ALZscience, .wordpress.com. I've had it for like 3 or 4 years now. I've been the as I just got married and I'm about to move. So it's been crazy, but I've got a few more articles in the pipeline. Thank you. Yes, yeah. We'll be starting soon. I just took a hiatus there. And I'm on Twitter at the same and Facebook at the same ALZ Science username. So I'm always looking for people who have questions, they can, tweet them at me or email me, and I'm happy to answer them. Or if you have involved in science communication, I always accept students or even faculty who are interested in writing guest posts. I think it's a useful educational experience for people to write about their own work and like learn how to communicate that to non-scientists. So basically, if you have questions or if you have something you want to talk about, feel free to reach out.
Nice. So I'll repeat that for people because you're cutting out again. Sorry. Shoddy Wi-Fi on my end, I think. alzscience.wordpress.com, and it's at alzscience on Twitter, right? And then at Facebook. Okay. And then, of course, everyone, I will post the links in the show notes. You'll have all the references, all of the relevant podcasts, of which there were many at this point. We've done so much Alzheimer's material, which is fitting, of course, because that's stuff I actually know things about. And then you can find more detail about everything there. Again, I cannot recommend Maya's blog enough. I would also recommend Alz Forum, alzforum.org, if you're really looking to dig into the science. That won't be everyone, but if basically you've digested everything that we have here and you're ready for more, it's the cutting edge. It's basically where all the Alzheimer's disease researchers, it's like their website they check every day. My boss is like constantly scanning that. I don't know about you, but
yeah, it's kind of like the, Twitter or Facebook of Alzheimer's researchers. So it's going to be a bit more technical than what you'd hear on this podcast, but it's a great extra source if you want more information.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, and other neurodegenerative diseases too, not just Alzheimer's. Like we said, there's Parkinson's, ALS, all these sorts of diseases. Maya, it's been awesome. Congrats, one, on getting married. Two, big things coming for you, right? So by the time this episode airs, I'm sure you'll kind of be getting your grad school gears going. Is there anything you want to say about that, or are you just kind of like ready to get at it?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to get my foot in the door and start with rotations. I'm trying out a little bit more of like a computational route. So like, getting a bit more involved in like how to model both diseases and therapies, and kind of use that to design our experiments. So that'll be interesting to try out some, get a little more programming experience under my belt and see where that takes me.
Awesome. Well, best of luck to you. We'll let people keep in touch. They can always find out more about your journey by some of your avenues. And by the way, we have like a network page. I need to add you into that because you should definitely be a part of that. It's kind of one of our back end projects. So thanks again, Maya. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening, all. As promised, here are the episodes of reference that you can go and check out. We've already done a lot again on Alzheimer's disease. If you want an intro for Maya, want to learn a little bit more about her story, you can go to episode 11. Highly recommend following that, especially if you're a student and you want to learn kind of how to get in the research game. I think Maya did it great, and obviously she's doing great for herself. That was episode 11 again. Episode 13, Maya and I actually talked about amyloid beta specifically. We really honed in on whether amyloid beta might be a hero or a villain in Alzheimer's disease, which is still kind of a hotly contested topic in the field. You'll find actually a lot of researchers will not agree on this subject. So that was a really interesting discussion. And then my conference episodes, when I went last November to San Diego for the Society for Neuroscience conference and the Alzheimer's Fast Track conference, AD Fast Track, put on by Bright Focus. Those are episodes 39, 41, 44, and 46. So all of those episodes were either directly at those conferences or they were recorded with people who I met at those conferences. All of them incredible experts on Alzheimer's disease. These people know more than I ever could, and they're just a wealth of information. We get really, really deep into the disease. So if you really liked this frequently asked questions episode, you want to know more, I highly recommend checking out those episodes. And we grouped them all on our homepage. That's straightfromascientist.com or sfspodcast.com. It'll redirect you, and you go up to the tab menu. On the right or at the end of the tab menu is Focus Alzheimer's Disease. Check that out. All those episodes are grouped there for you, and you can learn as much as your heart desires.